everyone. This is Matt Mason. This is a part of the program notes, the virtual program notes for the Altered Bodies piano recital. And today I'm joined by Kevin Swenson, and we're going to be talking about Electric Dreamscape number 3. So, obviously, I want to start off. What can you say about this being number 3 in your cycle?
Number three. Well, it's a cheater method, to come up with the title. But the original Electric Dreamscape number one, I composed for a friend of mine when I was studying at University of the Pacific, in an undergrad, my very last semester. She had written a grant to get a new violin, actually, and they gave her money to buy an instrument, um, which was kind of amazing. It must have been a lot. But anyhow, part of the grant application was that she was going to commission a piece for solo violin, and I ended up writing that. So around that time, I was writing my first pieces with Max and live performers. So that was probably, I think, the second or third piece I did where it was like a mic'd performer playing. Um, and I always had this idea, I'll go back and when I improve a little bit, I'll do some more pieces like this, and it'll be a kind of series, Electric Dreamscape series. So number two was closer to number three in terms of having kind of an indeterminate form. I performed that piece myself during the pandemic. It's for trumpet and Max with video and jitter, and it has three. It actually the logic of it is kind of similar, and I don't know how much I should say about the form of these other pieces, but it's kind of influenced a little bit by the moment form work of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. So there were three groups of material that were distinctive, and then I wrote little fragments of them, and the idea was you improvise on the fragments. And I also composed transition material between the fragments, so you could kind of improvise based on the transition material to go from group 1 to 2 and that kind of thing. And similar to number 3, there are secondary moments that appear, and they're kind of different in some way. They don't fit with the other stuff. So that was Electric Dreamscape number 1 and 2. Number 3, it just seemed natural because I had the idea. I mean, you were specifically asking for pieces with piano and electronics, so I thought, okay, this is a chance. And around that time, I was trying to write a piece that had completely generative score, but to do that is it's not so easy, and to do something interesting with it is really not easy. To do it is one thing, but it's like, okay, look at me, and then that's not enough really for an okay piece. So I decided to have fixed materials, but they come kind of semi-randomly, and it fit with the it's especially the idea of Electric Dreamscape number 2. So that's kind of the how it got to be Electric Dreamscape number 3.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to comment, this piece is made up of moments. And so to talk about how the piece works a little bit is the patch starts, and as I click through, the next section that it wants me to play will appear in gray, and then I will play that piece. And I want to say that this is a really fun kind of practice experiment, because so often when we're trying to do practice for any type of long form piano solo composition, we always run into the same issue of everyone starts at the beginning and then kind of moves forward at their rate, which often means that the beginning is really good, and then the middle is kind of okay, and then the ending is rough. But with this piece, I think that what's so fascinating for me as a performer that has now been able to work on it multiple times for performance. It's really fun to practice because you can kind of jump to wherever you need, and you never know what's going to come next. And as I was practicing it with the electronics, I found that there are some transitions from moments to secondary moments or moments to moments that are harder to kind of conceptualize than others because the
Mm.
mood shifts are so distinct, which makes it really fun then to practice. It almost becomes kind of a different beast entirely. And I always practice using a seam method to avoid that kind of pitfall of accidentally always starting from the beginning, where I'll connect two smaller segments together, and this is like that. So from a practice perspective, I think it's really interesting, and it leads to a lot of conversation about how you prepare to practice a piece as well, and how does one prepare to, for example, teach this piece if they were ever to, be a piano faculty and work with a student on this particular piece. How do you tell them to teach it? Because we're so used to that kind of rote back to front or front to back playing.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting that you kind of frame it that way because it's almost like it's not like reading music,
Mm-hmm.
on a page, but in programming the piece, I was actually trying to think how can I make it as close to reading music as possible, so that's why there's two systems and one is light and the other dark, and then it switches, and the darkened one you load the new system with the new material, so you can kind of read ahead a little bit like when you're reading music on paper. But um, it's interesting that for a performer, it's the important part is that it's not like that. So
Yeah, and I really found that in practicing it the first time, I focused on reading the staff that was lit up in front of me. Whereas our most recent performance was at the Napoleon New Media Festival. I really found that I was able to look ahead, see what was going to be coming next, and then kind of tailor the way that I was playing each moment to the next moment to really help build sort of a longer character for the piece in general. And I really enjoyed that process, and I think that it gives a lot of different expressive opportunities because no, just as the piece will not be played the same from performance to performance, each moment I think will not be played the same from performance to performance based on if you're tailoring it to that next piece. So I really found that as kind of a joyful thing to work on. So you talked about this being generative. A lot of it revolves around the pitch material, and I know the pitch material, but could you explain how you derived the pitch material?
yeah, yeah, of course. So I used your name, Matt Mason, not Matthew, but Matt. So
The correct name, thank
yeah, right, yeah. Um, it's something I've been doing for oh, quite a while now, at least a year, maybe more. And the idea is comes basically from Pythagorean numerology. It's not really that because in Pythagorean numerology they always would add the values assigned to the different letters of the name until it just became like 1 through 9. But I studied that several years ago when I was really studying tuning and Pythagorean tuning and some of that. But the idea kind of came from this, like, oh, they take the name and they make it numbers. It's like, why not make it a pitch class set? Because we're 21st century composers, and we're, for better or worse, often interested in those kinds of pitch structures. So yeah, I have a max patch that I built, and I can put in any words, and it will turn it into pitch class set. And there's different transformations you can do, quantize it to certain scales and that kind of thing. But this particular piece, I just used the regular prime form, which I think is 01358 if we take your name. So it's not really magical. I mentioned numerology, but the idea is not like somehow it infuses the piece with some magic thing, but it's just every performer is kind of different, and maybe if I take their name, I turn it into a set, it doesn't necessarily reflect them, but it just gives it a different flavor than if I had written it for anybody else, you know. So it's not magical, but it's kind of interesting.
Absolutely. And I think in discovering that, we've talked a lot about improvisation. And with this particular piece, one of the secondary moments is an improvisation piece. Being able to kind of rely on that pitch set knowledge and being a contemporary performer, knowing and being pretty fast with how to spell your pitch sets, it makes the improvisatory moments sound more like they belong. I think that in some cases, it's a little bit tricky to kind of throw an improvisation into a more classically oriented piece. I always think about when I was first learning Zhevsky's Down by the Riverside, which has two kind of cadential or cadenza-esque improvisation moments,
Mm.
and you really want to choose like one of the core themes to build off of. But if you don't use his kind of harmonic language, it can sound really out of place. And I think that goes obviously when people improvise cadenzas, if you're not kind of fitting into that knowledge, or, very intentionally rejecting it in certain ways, it can sometimes not fit. And so, with this piece in particular, I wanted to make sure that I had a good handle on the set so that when those improvisation, that really one improvisation moment came up, I knew exactly what to do and what notes I should and could be playing. And it's a very nice kind of reprieve, uh, because there's kind of a moment to just kind of clear your mind and let your hands do the things that they know how to do and are
Mm.
familiar with
Mm.
throughout, before going back into uh, the more, I think, mentally rigorous part of the piece. So it's a neat kind of dichotomy, to move through for sure.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, you always did it very well. I think a lot of trying to have an improvisatory moment comes to the performer, and I think it takes a certain kind of temperament. Like, I remember doing this deep listening exercises one time. This was at Pacific, so it's a bunch of undergrads. Some of these kids are 18. I was probably 22 or something, and we were doing one called "Go Fishing," where you're supposed to, I guess, go outside, but you could really do it anywhere. And the idea is like there's a lot of people, and they make sounds, found sounds. And if somebody else thinks, oh, that's a cool sound, they go fishing with them. That person caught a fish, and they make that sound. So some people had their instruments, and it's like they're playing Mahler 5 excerpts and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, it's not really the thing. So it's good, to have a performer who kind of understands like the aesthetic and the spirit. You're not trying to show off or something like this. It's like you're trying to fit with what the rest of the pieces.
For sure. Yeah, the deep listening exercises. It's one of those things where you really have to be a creative spirit to kind of dive into those, the deep listening, especially because it sticks out so much when all of a sudden you have like, now I'm gonna play the theme from Beethoven
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah.
this, and it's like, well, is that really the spirit of the exercise? And I think obviously the sooner that you start to engage students with that, especially, the sooner that they can actually start to develop that sense of individuality and the composition of sounds. And so, yeah, that is a great way to put it. Is it does take some seasoning to
Mm.
get used to the idea of improvisation. And I was really fortunate. David Vea, who was a instructor of composition at Illinois Wesleyan University, which is where I did my undergraduate in piano performance, was a great improviser. I took composition lessons from him, but the
Mm.
most memorable class that I had with him was actually a concert improvisation class, where I kind of learned how to do these more contemporary improvisations. And he was the type of professor that would be in the weeds with you, like improvising just as hard as he could, which sets such a great standard. He served as such an excellent role model for that kind of learning, to be able to say like, okay, my professor is doing it and he is full spirited, going wild. He's inside the piano, he's doing all sorts of stuff and fully committed to it. And I think that that is an important part of improvisation, is commitment. And sometimes if you see other people committing, you want to commit too. Whereas if you see people who, are improvising and they're not really committing, you might not want to commit for fear of standing out against them. There's kind of a herd mentality.
Follow the leader, yeah.
Yeah, so everybody just has to commit fully. So yeah, but it's a really great piece. I want to know, how has this piece, or if it has, impacted at all the way that you're composing now? Any pieces that you're doing, do you feel like you're taking influence from? How does this fit into the rest of your kind of opus works?
That's a good question. I think that it's a little bit hard to say, because the things I've done recently, like I wrote a string quartet for Jack Quartet, which will be done in March. And well, I guess I composed a piece with clarinet and Max MSP, actually. You're testing my memory a little bit. So the very next thing that I composed after Electric Dreamscape 3 is called, the title's not as cool, it's called Movements, for clarinet and Max. And it was done for Splice Institute over the summer. And really that piece was almost the opposite of Electric Dreamscape 3. It's through composed piece with 4 movements. The last movement does have little modules that the performer chooses to improvise upon, but it's not as it's interesting. Actually, Electric Dreamscape 3 is like, there's more chance, but it's also like more controlled in a way, because you only play each fragment once, and so the improvisation on modules is a little bit different kind of thing. But anyways, that piece is basically through composed. So I think in a way, if I wanted to sum up how has composing Electric Dreamscape 3 kind of influenced my more recent work, it's like I feel that in some ways I accomplished something with Electric Dreamscape 3 that I'd wanted to for a while, right? Like I mentioned Stockhausen. I remember seeing Klavierstück 11 for the first time on that huge sheet of paper, and like all the fragments, and it's like, start wherever you want and play until blah blah. It's like, oh, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. And so I wanted to do something like that, but that was, my version. It wasn't just straight up a copy of, whatever Stockhausen did. So I think that when I did Electric Dreamscape 3, that kind of like dream that 19-year-old Kevin had or whatever, I was okay, I did it, so I kind of let it go for a while. But maybe it could be interesting to revisit this generative form idea. I think some of the things you've told me, about playing it have given me hope. Like, okay, maybe it really works. It's not just a novelty or something like that. But it is.
Well, I hope so. That's all I'm trying to do. I like playing it, so I've played it enough now to be like, I enjoy playing it. So
you could probably almost do it from memory. You just
I would say, I'm getting there. Yeah, I really do feel like I have most of them down, at least when I see them. I think that that's the hard part, because if I see the first like 2 notes, I can basically play the rest of the line without looking. But it's funny, there's kind of a selective memory thing going on, where sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about this one. I know how to play it when it comes up, but I forgot that one would have showed up in the order. Which is, I think, entirely a memory thing, but it's just yeah, such a fun kind of piece to put together. And it's nice to have, actually, I think that that kind of generative score too, because we have talked about kind of creating like a set variant of it where it's the same every time. And I think that there's, a good reason to do that. But at the same time, that I think would be like we want like to maximize a recording. But I think in live performance, there's just something so fresh about being able to look at it for the first time in that variation and play through it, and knowing that, sometimes that contrapuntal secondary theme is going to come up, and I'm going to have to scoot back in my chair a little bit and really and get to it. So it's yeah, it's just a lot of fun to play. So big fan
Well,
of doing more of it. So,
well, thank you very much. You're
and I
playing it
also just
great.
keep telling you to submit it to things, and I'm like, I'll
Yeah,
I'll,
yeah,
I'll go. I'll drive. I'll drive to Charleston. Let's do
yeah.
it. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this. It's nice. Can you say anything about like where people might be able to find you if they're interested in more of your music?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. I guess it's called Kevin Swenson Music or something. Um, and I have a SoundCloud account under my name as well. But the best way to find that stuff is just going to be to go to my website, which is www.kevinswenson.com. I don't have any composer Instagrams or anything like that. So that's really it. It's just my website, kevinswenson.com. And yeah, you can listen to Electric Dreamscape 3 on there if you want, or come to Roosevelt and hear it there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, and I'm sure that people will love your piece as much as I do. So hopefully, we'll convert some new pianists to playing some generated composition.